and welcome to the Talking Crop Podcast. I'm Kathryn Seebruck, a commercial agriculture educator with University of Illinois Extension, serving Daviess-Stephenson and Winnebago counties. Talking Crop is a seasonal crop production podcast with episodes occurring every other week during the growing season between the months of May and September. In each episode, I bring on a guest speaker to discuss topics related to their areas of expertise, as well as to talk about any projects that they might be working on. In today's episode, I'm joined by Emily Hansen, who is also a commercial agriculture educator with Illinois Extension, and she serves LaSalle, Bureau, Marshall, and Putnam counties. Emily and I talked about soil health building practices, and plant soil feedbacks. It's no secret anymore that soil is a very complex system, and Emily does a great job of highlighting that and explaining what we can do to better care for our soils. And as always, please be sure to evaluate the Talking Crop podcast by clicking on the link in the video description. This only takes about a couple of minutes to complete, and it just provides me with the information that I can use to make this podcast a better listening experience for you. So you can let me know things such as whether the length is okay, what topics you're interested in hearing about, what speakers you want to hear from, etc. And even if you're enjoying the podcast and might not have any recommendations, that's also great to know via the evaluation as well. In next episode, I will be joined by Daniel Smith, who is the Southwest Outreach Specialist and Agronomist for the Nutrient and Pest Management Program at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And that episode will be a great continuation of today's, as we will be expanding on the discussion on cover crops by talking about the use of no-till and winter rye in a corn-soy rotation to build soil health and suppress weeds. And that episode will release on Wednesday, June 26th. And with all of that said, please enjoy this episode of Talking Crop, talking soil health and plant soil feedbacks with Emily Hansen. So Emily, welcome to the Talking Crop podcast. Thank you for being here today.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So I wanted to first start out by having you kind of introduce yourself to the audience and explain, who you are, what your role is, and some of your background about, kind of what did you do before being in this role, and, what area of expertise and area of interest do you have?
Yeah, so I'm new to Extension. I started in November as a commercial ag educator, and I work in the counties of LaSalle, Bureau, Marshall, and Putnam, so sort of in that I-80 corridor area. And I'm originally from and live in Grundy County, so I'm sort of familiar with the LaSalle area, and I'm excited to have this job and get started and get to know growers more in this area. A little bit about my background. I went to undergrad at Lewis University in Romeoville, and there I studied biology. So I've been on the biology side, my entire life in school. So when I was in undergrad, I got involved in a microbial ecology project. So we were looking at how glyphosate or Roundup may be impacting soil microbial communities. And with that project, I used these things called eco plates, they're like a multi-well plate, and inside them they have a bunch of different carbon sources or things that microbes can eat. And the sort of technique using the eco plates had been like a gateway for me to get into research and then stay involved in research. So in undergrad, then I used another biolog product similar to eco plates with a different project where we were looking at if invasive quagga and zebra mussels could be an environmental indicator of pollution, specifically, some sort of glyphosate contamination in rivers. So that was sort of, my experience in undergrad. And I think I had a really good time in undergrad and got involved in a lot of research. And so since I liked research so much and I really liked microbes, I decided I wanted to go to grad school. So for grad school, I went to Illinois State, and there I studied biology again, but this time I was more formally on that ecology and evolution side of things. So I was in the bees sequence at ISU, which is behavior, ecology, evolution, and systematics. And there I was in Vicki Borowitz's lab in the bio department, but I worked with Rob Reichert also in the ag department. And at grad school, I was working on a SARE-funded project. And SARE is a USDA program. It's Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education. And they provide grant funding, for these sort of sustainability focused projects. So with my work, we were looking at how different cover crops were impacting their soil microbial communities. So the eco plates came up again. That was what we used to look at this. And the thing with the eco plates is they're looking at the functional diversity of the community. So it's what they're doing. Um, a lot of other microbial work, especially in ag, will look at more like species level data or ratios of fungi to bacteria. We really didn't look at that with this. We focused more on what they could actually do in the soil. And that project was really great. I had a great time working on it. And that SARE, research was what was able to connect me ultimately with Extension and how I found out about
Mm-hmm.
Extension, and how I, got this job and really enjoyed that, I could find something that was on that education and outreach side of things, a little bit of science communication. Personally, though, I do come from a family farming background. My family's farmed in Grundy and Livingston County for generations. And I kind of came back to agriculture in a sort of roundabout way through school. So growing up, it was definitely a business. It was the family business.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't really see myself as wanting to be a farmer, but I didn't
Mm-hmm.
realize that there were other ways that you could be involved in ag, or
Right.
that, that there was this like research science side of ag. The agronomy was definitely not something that was talked about, was the price of grain, all of that. So I sort of came back to it in this roundabout way, and I don't think either of my parents really expected it, but here we are.
That's awesome. Yeah, I love hearing about how people kind of end up in ag, whether they started in ag, from their childhood or not. So that's really cool how, you kind of followed your passion and, in one direction. And like you said, in a very roundabout way, it brought you back into agriculture. So that's really cool. So with that, then, you mentioned how you talked about, or how you studied, excuse me, cover crops and their effects on, the soil structure, microbials, all of that. And so I'm assuming then that you got pretty knowledgeable in the area of kind of soil health and soil biology. Is that correct of me to assume?
Yeah, I would say soil health, soil biology are definitely my special interest areas. Definitely more on that living side of what goes
Mhm.
on in the soil.
Gotcha. So, I was hoping then that you could talk a little bit about soil health as a whole. So, I think it's a very kind of broad conceptual term, I think, a lot of the time, because there's just so much that goes into it. So, speaking, I guess, broadly, then, could you kind of describe and define what soil health is?
Yeah, to me, soil health is treating soil like what it is, a living ecosystem. So soil, it is not just dirt, it's not dead. It's alive. It's a home to many different organisms, many of which we can't see. So I'm going to rattle off some of my fun facts now about
Oh,
soil.
perfect.
In 1 tablespoon of soil, there are more microbes than there are people on this planet. And in general, there are more microbes on this planet. They outnumber people 1 billion to 1.
Oh my gosh.
The sort of fun fact in healthcare is that in your body, the cells that are in your body, 1% are human and 99% are microbe. So you're
Oh,
more
geez.
microbe than you are human.
That's wild.
Yeah, so soil is, it's one of our most biodiverse ecosystems on the planet, and really half of all of the biodiversity on the planet is found just like in our topsoil. So
Hmm.
this is, it's a really important resource. I think we take it for granted a lot of times. So to me, soil health is really just taking care of this resource. It's being a good steward, managing that land, in a way that maintains our soils and maybe even improves them. So I think, it's important to realize that our soil, that's what produces our crops. That's, the farmers are literally invested in the land. Soil is, a big asset there. But soil also has a really important role to play, in water quality and air quality. It regulates these things. It helps combat climate change. So, when plants go through photosynthesis, they're taking CO2 out of the atmosphere, and that ultimately is being deposited in the soil. So
Hmm.
soil, is helping fight those greenhouse gas emissions. Soil also supports really diverse ecosystems. You need that sort of baseline of a really rich microbial community to support the above ground plant life.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, you talking about how soil holds all of that biodiversity. It reminds me of probably one of my favorite quotes ever. I don't know if you've heard this one or not. I have it hanging in my office. Something along the lines of, despite all of our achievements, we owe our existence to a 6-inch layer of soil and the fact that it rains.
Yes, yes, exactly.
Yeah, so like you said, very, very important concept and thing for us to be cognizant of moving forward, as we as educators, talk to farmers about different stewardship practices and how it affects the soil directly. And so thinking in that vein, then, what then would you say? I mean, this seems like a silly question, but what is the importance of soil health to crop production, agricultural crop production specifically? Like, how does it directly affect crop production?
Yeah, so if our soil is functioning as it should, if, the microbes are cycling nutrients like they should, if water is moving through the soil like we should, that is a major asset to our crops. That is the foundation of our agricultural system. Um, and those two things, soil structure and how water is moving, um, what the microbes are doing nutrient wise, and then these sort of aspects of how soil itself can control erosion. These are all really important for agriculture. We want to make sure that the soil that we have on our fields is working right and that it's staying where it should.
Hmm. Definitely. And so then how would, this is a little bit conceptual, but how would a farmer kind of know, like, do I have a healthy soil or not? Like, are there different signs that they can, visibly and physically see, or is it more something that they have to like send in a test for?
Yeah, so some of this, it can feel a bit less tangible because we can't see the microbes, with the naked eye.
Hmm.
So it's hard to tell what is actually there in those terms. And with soil health, you can have healthy soils and you may or may not have higher yields. It's one of those things where it could be affecting your bottom line, it could not be, especially with
Hmm.
the kind of inputs that we're using, the better hybrids that we use, whether our soil health is affecting yields, that's kind of up in the air. But there are some things that we can, focus on visually. So water infiltration is a big one. So that is how water is moving into the soil and then through the soil profile. And we want water to absorb quickly. We don't want it to be flowing off the soil and not absorbing. And then we don't want it to be just sitting on the surface, puddling, flooding, any kind of things like that. And that goes into that structure of the soil, which we can also see. So soil, it's made up of aggregates, which are essentially chunks of soil that are held together by this microbial glue. And you want these chunks to keep their shape as that water moves through it. And that's what helps with the infiltration. And farmers can test this. There's a really simple test called the Slake test. And essentially what you do is you take like a glass of water and you would put a mesh screen in it, and then you would take a chunk of soil and put it on the screen. And then you would pour water through it. And if the soil clump just immediately dissolves into the water, you have poor aggregation. But if the soil clump stays together and doesn't really dissolve at all, then you have good aggregation. And that is what we want.
Hmm.
Um, we can also kind of look at the color. In Illinois, this this is a little tricky to do because we kind of have these rich dark soils anyways.
Hmm.
We're really lucky here to have super high organic matter in the soil. So organic matter is what makes the soils dark in color. Darker soils are generally healthier soils. But in Illinois, we are lucky in that way.
Right. Yes.
And then you can also kind of look at texture. So you want to be sort of like loose and fluffy, moist but not wet, have these like nice clumps, but you don't want it to be like hard and compacted.
Hmm. Right. And so then what should a farmer do or what can they do to achieve a healthy soil? Or if they feel they've already achieved that, how can they maintain it moving forward?
Yeah, so I think looking at some of these sustainable practices like reducing tillage, That can help with things, planting cover crops. It's good to have something living on the soil as much as possible. We have our crops in the spring, summer, fall, but there's really nothing in the winter. So if we can get a cover
Mhm.
crop out there, that's going to help hugely with, maintaining that soil structure, reducing erosion. And then, farmers can do soil tests. They should be doing soil tests, actually. Soil tests are very important for nutrient management. Most of our like standard commercial tests are just going to be looking at like your nutrient levels in the soil, which is still important, but it doesn't really go into that sort of health factor.
Right.
And there are some tests out there that claim that they can, look at these sort of health things, and they're not bad, they're not wrong, but they are expensive, and it can be very difficult to, compare the results from these tests. So, it's something that I'm hesitant to recommend for most people.
hmm Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that because my last guest that I had on our last episode, he talked about the soil health testing and how, there are some kind of drawbacks in a sense of, for some of the things that they're testing, there's not necessarily like a baseline that's been set. So some of those results are hard to interpret. But he was saying, we were talking after the episode, how there are certain things in a soil test or maybe a soil health test even specifically that are very tangible and good to know and be aware of, like, your soil aggregate stability, for example. I know you mentioned the aggregates and that you can test that in a soil test. So, pros and cons, and hopefully moving forward, those tests do become a little bit more reliable and have more of that, kind of basal information that we need to be able to make true recommendations. Um, so then you talked about you mentioned the like sustainability or the sustainable practices and how those are the things that can contribute to making a soil healthy. And this is something that I think about somewhat often is that I feel like, back when I was in school, a lot of the talk was about sustainable agriculture. And the sustainable word was used all the time, like constantly. And so nowadays, I feel like anymore the talk is all about regenerative agriculture. So, can you explain? I mean, is there a difference between the two and maybe kind of what kind of brought on that shift of talking about sustainable ag to then moving forward to regenerative ag?
Yeah, and I definitely experienced the same thing. When I was an undergrad, I feel like the word was sustainable intensification. That was like the buzzword.
Mm-hmm.
And now it's totally shifted to regenerative. What these terms mean, there's not exactly a set definition exactly, but generally the implication, if you're using the term regenerative, is that you're adding something to the soil. Regenerative practices really have that focus on building soil, maintaining soils. Sustainable as a whole has less of a focus on soil, and there can be other things incorporated into that. So I would say
Mm-hmm.
sustainable is maybe more of a broad term.
Okay. Yeah, definitely. That makes a lot of sense. And with those sustainable or maybe even regenerative practices, you mentioned a couple just a minute ago, like cover crops. Um, and so cover crops are obviously another big thing that have garnered a lot of attention. Lots of people are trying them at least, and then hopefully being successful in utilizing them. And as we're aware, there's lots of different benefits. And I think one of the main benefits really is that soil health aspect. So can you talk about, how cover crops, like what are they specifically doing and contributing to making our soils healthier?
Yeah. So the short of it is that cover crops, any sort of living plant material, it's providing microbes in the soil with a food source. So plants, they produce these carbon-rich compounds called root exudates, and those sort of act as a food source for microbes in the ground. Um, and these microbes, in turn, then will make resources more available for plants, like the nutrients in the soil. So that's really what the cover crops are doing, that it's a living thing that's continuing, to provide that nourishment for microbes. It also has the benefit that it's going to increase soil moisture, which is good to maintaining that microbial community. You want things to be moist, not overly wet, not overly dry, just a general moistness is what's going to maintain that community best. So, having cover crops in the winter when like we're maybe not experiencing a ton of precipitation, we might have like some snowfall events.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but sometimes we don't. Sometimes
Right.
last year it was we didn't really get a ton of snow. So having that sort of living cover is going to, keep the soil moist, hold it in place, and give those microbes something to feed on essentially through the winter. Because the thought
Mm-hmm.
there is then if we keep them nourished through the winter, it would jumpstart, their activity in the spring.
Okay. And then how do cover crops influence I mean, I think you kind of talked about this briefly already, but how do they influence their soil microbial community? Like you said that, they help to, give out those exudates and feed the microbes. Are there any other ways that they're kind of influencing the soil microbial community? Like, for example, are they, by implementing cover crops, are you then like affecting the diversity of that microbial community as well?
Yeah, so above ground diversity is directly linked to below ground diversity. So the more diversity we have in our cropping systems, the more diverse the microbial community is going to be. And diversity is kind of one of the main drawbacks in commercial agriculture is that you're generally operating on a monoculture. Even adding in a cover crop, a lot of times it's just one cover crop.
Hmm.
So that's kind of further contributing to the monoculture, but it helps to have more things in there because with this fruit production the plants do, they really can shape their microbial communities. They can recruit different microorganisms to the rhizosphere. So the rhizosphere is that area right around plant roots where most of that activity occurs. So, aside from that, the above ground parts of plants, so they're like their leaves, or when they die,
Hmm.
they're decomposing matter, all of that litter that plants produce, that has an impact on the microbes. So that, that's another food source that's adding organic carbon back into the soil, increasing that soil moisture. So, if we can do a cover crop, if we can not take it off of the soil completely once we're done, however you want to terminate it, if you leave it on there to decompose, that is going to help.
Hmm. And so the same concept then would occur with another more sustainable ag practice, which would be, at least reduced tillage, at most no tillage, right? So then would you then say that a reduced tillage system to a no-till system, of course, also then contributes to making a healthier soil? And then how so, if that is the case?
Yeah, so when we till our soils, that breaks up the networks that microbes have formed in the soil. So, it's a full community. They're influencing each other. They produce that microbial glue
Hmm.
that's essentially like a biofilm in the soil. And when we till, it's going to break that up. So the reasoning behind reducing tillage is that if we're not breaking up those communities, hopefully they're able to function better, do what they need to do for our crops. I know that it's more complicated than that. We need to have a prep seed
Hmm.
bed. So, something like strip till, I think, is a good, middle ground there.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. That's one of those things where, it's hard to implement a new practice as a whole, but to go from, um, you know, regular tillage practices to then straight to no-till, that can be a big jump. So yeah, strip till I think is one of those kind of like a happy medium, at least to start out with. Um, and so, something you studied as well, I find really interesting because I personally don't know a ton about this topic. You mentioned a lot about, the soil microbial community, but more specifically, you said that you looked at and have a good understanding of kind of plant-soil interactions, or I think maybe the term is like plant-soil feedback. Can you explain generally what that is and how those occur? And then also, kind of, is it always a beneficial thing, or is there sometimes maybe drawbacks to this sort of a system?
Yeah, so plant soil feedbacks has been everything that I've been talking about so far. It's how plants change the soil that they live in by their interactions with the microbial community in the soil. So, when plant soil feedbacks kind of started to be researched and discussed, It was really started by ecologists, and it was a way to explain community interactions with plants. So, if we're looking at an ecosystem, which plants are more abundant? How are they surviving? How do invasions happen, with non-native species?
Mm-hmm.
How does succession happen in a community? And all of this comes down to how plants are interacting with the soil. So, with those root exudates that I mentioned, there are, other compounds that plants produce as well that can influence the soil community. So one example of that is there's allelopathic compounds, which essentially are produced by one plant to inhibit the growth, survival, germination, or reproduction of another plant. So it's a way for plants to fight with each other. Um, and it's sort of tangential to ag in a way, because some of the cover crops that I looked at in my grad work, one was pennycress, and this is in the mustard family. And these plants produce compounds called glucosinolates, and these prevent other plants from forming relationships with mycorrhizal fungi in the soil. So that's preventing other plants from having good resource, be able to acquire resources from the soil. And that pennycress that I mentioned, that at ISU, it's a big deal, because it's being developed as a cash cover crop. The thinking there is that, it's hard to get farmers to, implement cover crops because it's an added cost.
Mm-hmm.
So an incentive for that would be if your cover crop was also a cash crop.
Yeah.
So they're domesticating pennycress to be used as an oil seed. And the thought is that it could be, used as sort of an alternative fuel in the aviation industry. So with that, one of the first things that they bred out of it was that glucosinolate production, because we don't want, our cash cover crop impacting our incoming crops.
Right.
So that got knocked out immediately. And then I think you had asked about, are these always positive interactions? Are they sometimes not beneficial? Yeah, so these can be both positive and negative, and it can vary in their strengths. So sometimes, we can have like a weak positive interaction or a strong positive interaction.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so if they're positive, these are beneficial. It's increasing a plant's ability to function in their ecosystem, be that a natural ecosystem or, an agro ecosystem. Doesn't matter. And then there can also be negative plant soil feedback. So these are not beneficial. That's like that glucosinolates, where it's decreasing a plant's ability to function in their ecosystem. Another example of a negative plant soil feedback is disease and pest accumulation in the soil. This can happen in agriculture. So with our repeated, monocultures of the same crop, we can have diseases and pests starting to accumulate in the soil. This is, your speaker mentioned it last week. It's why corn on corn is hard to do, because
Mm-hmm.
that's, one of the issues that comes up. So, a lot of this, with plant soil feedbacks, it really, it just comes down to the microbes in the soil. Are these plants, are they encouraging beneficial microbes or not? Are there soil-borne pathogens accumulating, or are there not?
Mm-hmm. So with that, is this you talked about too how the plant soil feedbacks and interactions is something that has been more of like an ecology study focus. Do you know if this is something that in agricultural research or is it being focused on at all?
I've seen a lot more papers coming out recently that are trying to apply this framework of plant soil feedbacks to agricultural systems. Because really, it's a way to think about how plants are interacting with each other, how they're interacting in that community, and whether that's a natural system or an agricultural system. Plants are plants, soil is soil. It's all related, it's all applicable. So I've seen a lot of work coming out lately, looking at plant soil feedbacks and how we can kind of use them to improve the resiliency of our cropping systems, increase, better the functioning of our soils, and how we can like exploit these plant soil feedbacks. So, that's kind of the thing in agriculture. It's a business. We're here to make money. So how
Mm-hmm.
can we make the soil work for us? Is there a way
Yeah,
that we can harness these natural systems, and make them better?
absolutely. Yeah. So with understanding that, there are these plant soil feedbacks and interactions in the soil, and that, like you just said, there are ways in agriculture, and we'll probably learn more about this in the future, that they could be, um, utilized in operation. Um, just having that like general understanding of plant soil interactions, like from a farmer's perspective, having that understanding, is there anything then that a farmer can do to maybe change the way they manage their crop based on, that understanding of those feedbacks and interactions?
Yeah, so I think the first step for farmers, is really acknowledging that the soil is a living thing, that it's part of this whole ecosystem that we have going in agriculture. Because then we can start thinking about how are our plants and our crops interacting with the soil, and then how are our management decisions affecting these plant soil feedbacks. So are the choices that we're making causing negative feedbacks? Are they causing pests and disease to accumulate? Or are they causing positive feedbacks? I think an example of this is how we rotate corn and soy. So you put soy before corn. That's essentially trying to break up the negative plant soil feedback of having corn on corn.
Hmm.
And soybeans are able to fix nitrogen through the relationships that they form with nitrogen fixing bacteria in their root nodules. So, the thought behind putting soy first is that it adds some of that nitrogen back into the soil. So it's breaking up that plant soil feedback. And we can do a similar thing with cover crops. So, adding in that extra level of diversity there is going to break up that system even more. And, when we're choosing our cover crops, we can choose them based on maybe the intended outcome that we'd like. So, if we want more of that added nitrogen, we can pick like a legume cover crop like clover or
Hmm.
peas. If we want to build more carbon in the soil, we can pick something like cereal rye that produces, a ton of above and below ground biomass. So, you know, we could also add in a mix of cover crops. I think for me,
Hmm.
that's something that's really exciting. That was something that I worked on in grad school. Um, because adding in that above ground biodiversity increases our below ground biodiversity. So adding in a bunch of different cover crops, that's sort of adding to that system. So, I think this is it's a way for growers to think about, soils in a new way, how they can manipulate these soil bacteria to benefit their cash crops, how they can choose a cover crop, from these diverse different functional groups, grasses, legumes, brassicas, to have, an intended impact on their cash crop. Um, yeah.
Right. And so, as you're talking about that, it makes me think a lot of another kind of up and coming process in agriculture, and that is, or practice, I should say, and that is the use of biologicals. So, kind of adding, I'm obviously very much simplifying this, it's more complicated than this, but basically adding biological material like microbes to the soil or their byproducts. So, would you agree that like using biologicals is kind of like in a roundabout way a way of directly affecting kind of those, maybe not the plant soil interactions specifically, but kind of directly affecting that microbial community, which then affects our crops?
Yeah, I do agree with that. And I think, sort of the intended goal with a lot of biologicals is to mimic what we would see naturally with healthy soils. It's a way
Hmm.
to get it more directly. Um, I can't speak too much to the efficacy of certain products over another, but it's definitely, it's a new area. It's something that's being researched. There's new products coming out every day. So
Hmm.
I'm excited to see where things go with biologicals.
Yeah, I am too. It's really interesting, and all of what we talked about today I think is really fascinating because like you mentioned way towards the beginning, that soil microbial community is not something we can see, and yet clearly it is very heavily affecting our crops, all throughout the year, whether we have a crop in or it's, over the winter and fallow, and there's maybe not a cover crop in the system. And we talked a lot about different soil health practices like using cover crops, like reducing tillage, going to no-till, etc. And I know you and I think both mentioned how it's difficult for farmers to implement new practices like that if it's not something that they've done in the past. So, what barriers are there that farmers face when trying to implement these soil health practices? And, thinking about those barriers, kind of what is that balance of the barrier versus that benefit or the benefits that we've been talking about of implementing them?
Yeah, I'm definitely starting to see, more farmers considering using these practices and actually implementing them. I think, one of the first barriers is just the knowledge issue that it's something new. They're maybe not super familiar with it. Um, and they just want to know more. What are cover crops? How do we use them? What do I have to think about when I'm seeding them or terminating them?
Mm-hmm.
It's definitely there's a lot that goes into it. I think the other major barrier is cost. So because these soil health benefits are kind of intangible in some ways, they don't always directly impact yields. It can be hard to justify the added cost of putting in a cover crop. So, I think that's why stuff like pennycress being domesticated as a cash cover crop is really promising. That's also why a lot of these cost share programs are really fantastic. So, you know, things like EQIP, CSP, CRP, all of these sort of assistance programs that can help farmers, implement some of these conservation practices.
Hmm. Yeah, those are very beneficial. Definitely a step in the right direction to, kind of getting that farmer's foot in the door, essentially, of getting started with these practices. Well, Emily, thank you so much again for joining me today. I really enjoyed our conversation. This is a really fascinating topic. And appreciate what you do as an educator, and hopefully we'll connect again in the future.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.